Some more live reading of Clarice Lispector's The Apple in the Dark, which has proven to be somewhat of a... Mind you, I've only read 2 of her books. Well, this is the second I've started, just because I bought this copy, which is kind of rare. It's a first edition. Let me change the name of this. Is that what I want to say here? Save. All right, let's open this, turn this down. No, that's not what we want. Let's go to it. Oh, we live, bruv. I know we're live. I just want to know if we're... This ain't right. Or is it? Where is the bloody chat? There it is. We got the chat. We're in it. This is the second part of chapter 2. The Apple in the Dark by Clarice Lispector. Translated from the Portuguese with an introduction by Gregory Rabassa, which I skipped. But I'm picking up back here on chapter 2. Chapter 2, page 20. When that was all over, Martim stood up, and without asking himself what he was doing, he knelt down in front of a dried-up tree to examine its trunk. It did not seem that he had to give any deep thought to the problem in order to resolve it. He had disengaged himself from that too. Then he picked off a piece of half-hung bark, rolled it between his fingers with an attention that was a little affected, moving it about as if he were in front of an audience. His study was done in the peculiar fashion that comes when what is unknown becomes organized, and Martim arose as if by command and continued on his way. It was farther along that he stopped short in front of the first bird. Set off against the great light, there was a bird. Since Martim was free, that was the question. A bird in the light, with the minute care to which he had become accustomed. He immediately began to work on this fact greedily. The blackbird was perched on a low branch at eye level and unable to fly. Paralyzed by the bestial look of the man, she moved about with less and less volition, trying to face up to what was going to happen and shifting her weight nervously from one foot to the other. There they were, the two of them, facing each other until the man grabbed her with a heavy and powerful hand, which, with the physical kindness of a heavy hand, did not hurt. In the palm of his hand the bird trembled and dared not make a peep. The man looked at her with vulgar and indiscreet curiosity, as if he had imprisoned a handful of living wings. In a little while the bird's small, dominated body stopped trembling, and she closed her minute eyes with feminine softness. Now only a faint, rapid heartbeat against the man's extremely sensitive fingers showed that the bird had not died, and that the snugness had at last lulled her to rest. Startled by the irrevocable, I prefer irrevocable, because it sounds more sharp. Startled by the irrevocable perfection of what was happening to him, the man snorted and looked at the little creature. The satisfaction made him laugh aloud. His head turned back, his face looking at the great sun. Then he stopped laughing, as if that had been a heresy, and deeply concerned with his task, and with his hand half closed, he let just the hard, sharp head of the bird show. The man began to walk again. Oh no, it's CBGBs. It's not Russian, it's Ukrainian. The man began to walk again with greater strength, aware of his companion. The only thing he thought about was the noise his own shoes made, echoing softly in his sun-fired head. You should be happy I'm reading this book. It's somewhat of a rare book, and I think this translation is extra rare because I believe that the newer editions are by some other guy who's trying to make money off this woman. And soon, in cadence with his steps, the physical pleasure of walking once more started to take hold of him, and also a pleasure faintly sensed, as if he had taken some aphrodisiac that made him desire not a woman, but a response to the thrill of the sun. He had never been so close to the sun, and he was walking faster and faster, holding the bird in front of him, as if he were running to the post office with it before it closed. Is it cool? Weren't you the one that said you loved communism, or was it just Russia? The vague mission was getting him drunk. The lightness born of thirst had suddenly put him into an ecstasy. This is The Apple in the Dark by Clarice Lispector, her last book. This is actually a book that was produced in her lifetime. Most of the copies out there are not. It was a 1967 book, translated from the Portuguese with an introduction by Gregory Rabassa. I got this book, I think, for $75 on Thrift Books, which is somewhat of a discount. The lightness born of thirst had suddenly put him into an ecstasy. That's it, yes, he said aloud and without meaning, and it seemed more and more glorious, as if he were going to fall down dead. Is this a neutral telling? What's that mean? I have no affinity for Clarice Lispector, but she was mentioned by somebody who I follow on so-called BookTube, and I happened to see this book on Thrift Books, and I basically don't like to pay. I'd rather pay $75 for a first edition than I would $25 for just some trade paperback that's basically worthless outside of the fact that it's been reissued. That's it, yes, he said aloud and without meaning, and it seemed more and more glorious, as if he were going to fall down dead. People like to be retroactive about historic pieces. I'm not sure what that means. What do you mean retroactive about historic pieces? I have no clue what this book's about. I've never read it. This is the first time I've read it. I've read one of her books on suggestion. I thought it was a failure. This one is falling in the same vein, except it's like 30 years after. I have no comprehension of what this book's about, because I do not like to look up a book, what it's about, the synopsis. I just like to read it. And most of the time I hate the book. But that's just the way it goes. I'm not a big fan of books, even though I have like 7,000 of them. Most of them are failures, but it's the concept of the book. And something like Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs, which is a brilliant book, but I mean, a lot of people call stuff brilliant, like Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, which is just rubbish. I mean, I think any moron could write that book. Not many people could write Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs. He looked around at the perfect circle of light that the heavens were holding in an awe-inspiring horizon, an horizon which drew closer to the land, softer and softer, softer and softer, softer and softer. The softness upset the man with the pleasure of a tickle. That's it. Yes. Yes. I thought it said you, but it says yes. And he was free, freed by his own hands. He had suddenly realized that this was what had happened 2 weeks before. I'm not sure what you mean by the retroactive about historic pieces. Do you mean they try to make their own interpretation of it? Then he repeated with unexpected certainty, "That's it, yes." Every time he said those words, he was convinced that he was referring to something. He even made a gesture of generosity and largesse with the hand that held the bird, and he thought magnanimously, "They don't know what I'm talking about." Then, as if thinking had been reduced to seeing, and that the confusion of the light had quivered in him, as it does on water, it occurred to him, in a confused refraction, that even he had forgotten what he was talking about. But he was so obstinately convinced that it was something of the greatest importance, something so vast that it was no longer conceivable even to him, that he haughtily respected his own ignorance and gave himself savage approval. "That's it, yes." Well, more they bend it to what they want it to say. We love communism in this house. What do we got? A bunch of commie fans here? "Can't you say anything else?" The man stopped short, surprised, as if she had been put before him. He saw again the face of the impatient woman who once before had asked him that just because he had not answered. The hell does that mean? The man stopped short, surprised, as if he had been put before him. As if she had been put before him. He saw again the face of that impatient woman who once before had asked him that just because he had not answered. I don't understand what that means. He before had asked him that just because he had not answered. Whatever. From the very first, the phrase had sounded like so many others. As streetcars dragged along and the radio kept right on playing without interruption, and the woman listened to the radio without interruption and hope. And one day he would break the radio as streetcars dragged along, and meanwhile the radio and the woman had nothing to do with the careful rage of a man who most likely already held within himself the fact that someday he would have to begin at the exact beginning. He was now beginning with Sunday. Michael Jackson. Right. But this time, the simple, irritating phrase, ringing in the red silence of the wasteland, made him stop short, so perplexed that the bird woke up and wiggled its imprisoned wings inside his hand. Martim looked at it bewildered, frightened, and having a bird in his hand. The son's drunkenness was suddenly over. What kind of fucking name is Martim? Martim! Is that like two names? Marty and Tim? Also, when you're reading old books, wash your hands beforehand. That way you don't get your dirty paws on there. Sober. Wait, I think I skipped the part. No, I did not. The son's drunkenness was suddenly over. Did I already read that? Sober, he looked with modesty at the thing in his hand. Then he looked at the Sunday waste. I thought I read something about Sunday. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Sober, he looked with modesty at the thing in his hand. Then he looked at the Sunday wasteland with its silent stones. He had been sound asleep as he had been walking, and for the first time he was now waking up. And as if a new wave from the sea were breaking against the rocks, clearness took over. Son's drunkenness. The son is thirsty, buddy. Everyone's thirsty for communism. Calmly, the man looked at the bird. Without any command, his now innocent and curious fingers let themselves obey the lively movements of the bird, and passively they opened. The bird flew off in a flash of gold, as if the man had flung it, and it perched anxiously upon the highest stone. From there it looked down at the man and peeped incessantly. Paralyzed for a moment, Martim looked up at it, and there down at his own empty hands, which looked back in astonishment. Recovering, however, He ran furiously toward the bird and followed in for some time, his heart beating with anger, his impatient shoes tripping over stones, his hands gasping out in a fall that made a small stone bounce along with several dry jumps. This is a fucking tongue twister. Along with several dry jumps until it was quiet. The silence that followed was so hollow that the man still tried to bear the last thud of the stone so he could calculate the depth of the silence into which he had knocked it. Until a great wave of light unwound the waiting tension, and Martim could look down at his hand. It was burned, and there was a trickle of blood. He had forgotten about the chase and was very much involved with himself now. His dry lips sucked on the scratch with the loving voracity of a lonely person. At the same time, thirst had awakened him, and the blood in his mouth had given him a warlike attitude that quickly went away. When the man finally lifted up his eyes, the frightened bird was waiting for him, as if it had been resisting only because it had wanted to give up. Martim held out his injured hand and took it up with forceless firmness. This time the bird wiggled less, and recognizing its old shelter, snuggled up to sleep. Carrying its light weight, the man continued on his way among the stones. "I can't say anything else," he said to the bird, trying out a certain sense of shame not to look at it. Only afterwards did he seem to understand what he had said, and then he looked the sun in the eye. "I have lost the speech of other people," he then repeated slowly, as if the words were more obscure than they were, and in some way more praiseworthy. He was serenely proud, his eyes clear and satisfied. Then the man sat down upon a stone, straight, solemn, and empty, keeping the bird firmly secure within his hand. Something was happening to him, and it was something that had meaning. Even so, he had no words for what was happening. A man was sitting down, and he had no words for anything. Therefore, he was sitting down. That is how it was. The best part is that it was indisputable and irreversible. The truth is that what had been happening to him had a weight that had to be borne. It was easy for him to recognize the familiar weight. It was like his own weight, even though it might be something quite the opposite, something he could not seem to balance on a scale. He was vaguely aware of that. Sometimes in his old apartment, he would get that uncomfortable feeling that was a mixture of pleasure and anxiety. It had always ended up in some decision that had nothing to do with his troublesome feeling. True, he had never felt it with that final clean feel that the wasteland gave, the wasteland where he was aided by the very shadow which unmistakably delimited him upon the ground. Oh my God, we got a whole set of nationalities now. That thing that, are these all the communist states? I honestly couldn't name one of those flags. Although that one red and blue one looks like Denmark or something. That thing that he was feeling must have been, in the last analysis, himself and nothing else. The pleasure that the tongue has of being in its own mouth, and the lack of a name, like the name of pleasure the tongue has in its mouth. That is all it was, after all. I read Dune recently after not reading for years. When reading it, I felt like I had to word everything out in my head before I could understand what I was reading. I never read Dune. I've sold a few of the first editions, which I found nice copies, but I don't care about Dune. Is this from a lack of reading or just how I am? Could be both, buddy. But a person was always a little aware of what was, and being aware was to be. That is how, then, that on his first Sunday he was. In the meantime, he had become fairly intense. He moved about uncomfortably upon his stone with a physical answer to the immateriality of his own tension, the way a person does who is disturbed. And if he did that, it was because even if he had not known himself, he knew enough about himself for a reply. That was not enough, however. He looked about like a person looking for a woman's counterpoint, but there was no synonym unless it was a man sitting down with a bird in his hand. This book is a fucking tangle of nothingness. Then he waited, patient and upright, for the thing to pass away without its even touching him. You've never read this before. How can you verbalize everything so easily? It's amazing, really. I don't know. The fact, I could even read it upside down if you want me to. I learned a while back that I could actually read upside down. Where was I? The fact was that the man had always had a tendency to fall into profundity, which someday still would lead him to an abyss. That is why he wisely took the precautions to abstain. His contention, superficial and easily separated from the depth, gave him the pleasure of a contention. His had always been a difficult balance, one of not falling into the voraciousness with which every new wave awaited him. A whole past lay just a step away. From the caution with which the man was merely trying to keep himself alive, and nothing more, the way an animal will light up only in its eyes, keeping behind it that vast untouched animal soul. Then, without touching it, he set himself to wait impassively until the things should go away. Is what insightful? Before it went away, he involuntarily recognized it. That thing was a man thinking. Then, with infinite displeasure, physically confused, he remembered in his body what a man thinking was like. A man thinking was that thing which, when it saw something yellow, would say with dazzling elan, is that elan? Something not blue. Not that Martim had really arrived at thought. He had recognized it in the way one recognizes the possible movement in the shape of motionless legs. And he had recognized more than that. That thing had really been with him all through his flight. It had only been through neglect that just now he had almost let it spread itself out. Then, startled, as if in alarm, he had recognized the insidious return of a vice. He had such a repugnance for the fact that he had almost been thinking that he clenched his teeth in a painful mask of hunger and abandonment. He turned around restlessly toward all sides of the wasteland, looking among the stones for a means by which he could regain his former powerful stupidity, which for him had come to be a source of pride and command. But the man was disturbed. Why should he not be then a person able to take 2 free steps and not fall into the same fatal error? Because the old system of useless thinking and of even delighting in thinking had tried to return. Sitting on the stone with the bird in his hand, he felt pleasure in treating her carelessly, and if he were careless for 1 minute more, he would bring back in one gush his whole previous existence, when thought had been a useless act and pleasure only shameful. Unprotected, he shifted about on the hot stone. He seemed to be searching for an argument that might protect him. He needed to defend the thing that with such enormous courage he had conquered 2 weeks before. With this enormous courage, the man had finally stopped being intelligent. Oh no, what the hell is this? Azbenka? Or had he never really been intelligent? That happy suspicion made him blink his eyes with great shrewdness, because if he could manage to prove that he had never been intelligent, then it could also be shown that his own past had been some other, and it could be shown that something in his very own depths had always been complete and firm. The fact is, he then thought, using great care as he tried that defensive trick, the fact is that I was only imitating intelligence, as if I had been able to swim like a fish without actually being one. The man moved about contentedly. I was imitating, of course. Well, if imitating meant having taken first place in statistics, he had taken first place in statistics. The fact is, he concluded with great interest and the essential lack of respect which is what makes a person imitate. I have only imitated intelligence. And along with him, millions of men were copying with great effort the idea of what it was to be a man. Along with him, thousands of women were copying with great care the idea of what it was to be a woman. And along with him, hundreds of people of goodwill were copying with superhuman effort the very face and the idea of existence with the anguished concentration with which acts of good or evil are imitated, the daily fear of committing an act that is true and therefore incomparable, and therefore inimitable, and therefore disconcerting. And all the while there was something old and rotten in some unidentifiable place in the house, and people slept restlessly. Discomfort is the only warning that we copy, and we listen to ourselves attentively between the sheets. But we have been carried so far away by imitation that the thing we hear comes to us with such slight sound that it could be a vision, just as invisible as if it were in the darkness that is so deep that hands are useless. Because a person will even imitate comprehension which never would have been invented except for the speech of others in words. This is your favorite channel in the whole world, buddy? But there was still disobedience. Then, by means of the great leap of a crime, 2 weeks before he had taken the risk of having no security, and he had reached the point of not understanding. Yellow sun sitting on a stone without the least bit of security, the man was now rejoicing, as if not understanding were a kind of creation. The caution that a person uses to transform one thing into another thing, comparable and subsequently approachable, and only after that moment of security will he look about and let himself be seen, because fortunately it is already too late not to understand. Martim had lost that precaution, and not understanding had suddenly given him the whole world. Well, then I fucking own every universe because this book makes zero sense. World, that wasn't part of the book. The whole world, which is to tell the truth, was completely empty. The man had rejected the speech of others and did not even have a speech of his own. And in the meantime, hollow, mute, he was rejoicing. Things were fine. Then, just as at the beginning of the conversation, that person was sitting on a stone on Sunday. And so the man now felt himself so far removed from the speech of others that with a perverse pleasure and a daring that had come to him out of the same security, he attempted speech again. It puzzled him, as it puzzles a man who brushes his teeth in the morning and does not recognize the drunk of the night before. I mean, that's a fucking non sequitur. He brushes his teeth in the morning and does not recognize the drunk of the night before. And as he fooled around now, still cautious, albeit fascinated with that dead language, as an experiment, he tried to give the ancient and so familiar name of crime to that so very nameless thing that had happened to him. But crime, the word resounded emptily in the wasteland, nor did the voice that spoke the word belong to him. Then he finally convinced that he would not fall captive to the ancient speech. He tried to go a little further. Had he perhaps felt horror after his crime? Horror! Nevertheless, that was the language expected of him. 2 good books, one about Fred Burke, who came over to Benton Harbor in the 30s, was interesting. He was a mobster. It was good. Also, Life in the Unseen Worlds. You might like both. I might. Weird thing is, when I replay these videos, I don't get the chat, so you might want to leave that on one of the videos. For some reason, I don't get these. The chat doesn't appear when I play these back. Benton Harbor. I went to Benton Harbor one time, about 20 years ago. It was not a ritzy place. But horror, too, had come to be a word from that time before the great blind leap he had taken along with his crime. The leap had been taken, and he had jumped so far that it had ended up becoming the only event he was able to or cared to cope with, and even the motives of the crime had lost their importance. The truth is that the man had wisely abolished the motives, and he had abolished the crime itself. Having had certain practice with guilt, he knew how to live with it without discomfort. He had committed crimes before that had not been recognized by law, so that he most likely considered it just a piece of bad luck that 2 weeks before he had committed one that had recognition. A good upbringing and long experience in life had made him expert at being guilty without betraying himself. No ordinary torture would make his soul confess its guilt, and a great deal would be necessary to make a hero cry in the end. And when this does happen, it is such a depressing and repugnant spectacle that we cannot bear it, unless we feel ourselves betrayed and offended. Our surrogate must be unpardonable. It so happens that by special circumstances that the man had to become a hardened hero in 2 weeks. He represented himself. Guilt no longer touched him. It's got a blue beacon washout. I'm a trucker. I love hearing about Allie every day. Yeah, Allie's a champ. It's crazy that the only way I found out about her diary was I took a Google Lens picture, or a Google Lens, whatever you call it. I took a picture of it, and then I went like this, and it appeared, and it showed her diary. Found it at, where did I find it? At some antique mall, along with some of her family members. I don't know where I put those photos. They're around somewhere. But I still haven't figured out which one. I know I have a picture of one of her twin sisters, and maybe they were, what's that called? Exact twins? Not exact. But they're definitely probably her sisters, because her sisters, I think, were 10 years older, 7 years older, something like that. So I have a picture of her brother who was a fireman. I can confirm that it's him. And I believe I have a picture of her younger brother who may have died. And then one of her sisters. And then what else is there? I think there's just pictures that may be part of the family. But obviously, unless you see a picture of somebody who has been identified, it's pretty hard to find them. I did Google Lens pictures of all of them, and the only one that showed up was Allie. Actually, I think her brother may have showed up, but sometimes it doesn't hit the right result, and sometimes it does. I think the Allie one, I did it like 5 different times before it finally showed her diary. I would like to go to the historical museum and see the diary myself, but since the one lady copied it complete from the diary, I don't need to, I guess. Crime? No, the great leap. These did not sound like his words, obscure, like the entanglement of a dream. His crime had been an involuntary vital motion, like the reflex of a knee when it is tapped. The whole organism had joined together so that the leg suddenly gave the irrepressible kick, and he had not felt any horror after the crime. What had he felt then? Stunning victory. That was it. He had felt victory. Astonished, he saw that the thing was working unexpectedly, that an act still had the value of an act. And furthermore, with a single act, he had made the enemies he had always wanted to have, other people, the others. But even further, he himself had finally become incapable of being that former man. For if he returned to that self, he would be obliged to become his own enemy. And to use the speech by which he had lived, he simply could not be friendly to a criminal. Therefore, in one fell swoop, he was no longer a collaborator with other people, and in one fell swoop, he had ceased to collaborate with himself. For the first time, Martim had found himself incapable of imitating. Who, Allie? I don't know. I know they sent her to a few doctors in Detroit, but for whatever reason, they had money, so it's not like the family couldn't afford to try more doctors. I think they were all in denial that she was going to die. The only one who seemed to know was the guy named Durbin Newton, who later became a lawyer. And he told her about a year before she died that she had about a year to live. I think that's what he said. He said, "You're going to die," and she was shocked by him saying it. Although she looks pretty gaunt in this picture. I mean, she does look sick, but you wouldn't say that unless you knew that she died, so. $3. That's all I paid for this photo. Shocking, though, that I found that journal online. They mention in the diary, she mentions that she had a little autograph book and that people wrote in it, so maybe they have that at the Historical Society. That'd be nice. Where's that one book? This thing right here, the 5-year diary, is somewhat of a piece of garbage. But, and I know what happened to this woman. She lived to be 94, I think. She lived a long life. I never thought that women, or I guess 15-year-old girls, were allowed to date in the 1930s. This girl dated everybody. It's crazy. But this thing's falling apart. Another one I have somewhere. I just don't know where I put it. It's about a farm woman somewhere in northern Michigan, central northern Michigan. And it's pretty boring. It's just stuff about chickens and stuff, but I was going to read it, but I still can't find it. I don't know what I did with it. I think I stuck it in a tote somewhere when I was trying to sort things out. Yes, in that moment of stunning victory, the man had suddenly discovered the power of a gesture. The good thing about an act is that it reached us. In just 1 minute, Martim had been transfigured by his own act, because after 2 weeks of silence, it had become quite natural for him to call his crime an act. Oh shit, I'm disconnected. I'm disconnected, brobs. Well, I'm just going to keep reading, but I'm probably not going to be able to read the screen, so until I finish reading this portion of the book. How many more pages are there in this fucking chapter? Probably going to read a couple more pages and then start it over. It is true that the feeling of victory had lasted only a fraction of a second. There was no time after that. In an extraordinarily perfect and well-oiled rhythm, there followed that deep stupefaction in which there had been such need for this, his present intelligence to be born, and it was as crude and wily as that of a rat, simply that and nothing more. But for the first time it had been a tool. For the first time his intelligence had immediate consequences, and he had come into such total possession of it that he had been able to guide it with great skill so that it would make him secure, make his life secure, so much so that he immediately knew how to flee, as if up until then everything he had done in his daily life had been just an indistinct attempt at action. And then that man had finally become real, a real rat. And any thought from within that new intelligence was just an act, even if it was rough like a voice that never had been used. Right now he was not very much of a rat, but even if a rat, there was nothing in him that could not be utilized. The thing was fine and deep. That man had fit himself entirely within the dimension of a rat. Yes, all this had followed upon the crime to such a point of perfection that Martim had not even had time to think about what he was doing. But before, for a fraction of a second, before the conquest, because one day a man had had that one great rage. He had had that rage, and for the first time with candor, he had admired himself like a child who discovers himself in the mirror. Apparently, with the accumulation of kindness without the act of kindness, with the thought of love without the act of love, with heroism without heroism, not to mention a certain growing imprecision about existence, which had ended up as the impossible dream of existence. Apparently, that man had come to forget that a person is able to act, and to have discovered that he really had already acted involuntarily, had suddenly given him a world so free that he was stunned at his victory. That man had not even asked himself if there was someone who could act by means other than a crime. What he knew and feared was only that a man had to have a great rage one day. Did he? Did he really? This book just goes on and on. Doesn't really say anything. And I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to have to restart this thing because I am no longer able to see my screen over here. And my phone screen is so destroyed that I can't even read it. So I think I'm going to stop this anyway and then bring out this book. Black Square and Compass, 200 Years of Prince Hall Freemasonry. With my brother, Joseph A. Walks Jr. It's my brother. All right, I'm going to start a new live here shortly, since I don't think I can exit out of this and restart my internet, since I'm basically stealing internet off my own phone. I think wonder if I can pause this. Didn't think I can pause it. Let me see what I can do here. What's this? What does that mean? Of course, I can't read the bottom of my phone because it has so much damage to it. I wonder if I push the plus that stops it. Let's see what happens. No. Plus, there it goes. See what happens. Nothing. How about the arrow? Nothing. Whoa. Something happened. What the fuck is that? I don't know what I did here. Not sharing shit, buddy. I want to X out of this thing.